He thought he could humiliate her in front of an entire lecture hall. But he had no idea he was about to witness the moment that would unravel his reputation piece by piece. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with low murmurs, the kind that filled the air before something important began. Sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting long golden lines across polished wooden floors, while rows of students adjusted their laptops and notebooks, waiting for the man who was known across campus as both a genius and a storm, Professor Richard Harrington, a name that carried weight in academic circles from Boston to Silicon Valley. A man whose sharp intellect was only matched by his sharper tongue, and when he stepped into the room, the energy shifted instantly, conversations died mid-sentence, and even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to retreat, as if the room itself recognized authority when it entered. Harrington walked with measured precision, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly in place, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity but with judgment, always searching, always evaluating, always deciding who belonged and who didn't. And today, his gaze paused for just a fraction of a second longer than usual on someone seated quietly near the back, a woman who didn't quite fit the picture of his world. Emily Carter sat with her hands folded neatly over a worn notebook, her simple gray cardigan draped over a plain white blouse, her brown hair tied back in a low ponytail that spoke of practicality rather than style. And while most students leaned forward with eager anticipation or nervous energy, Emily sat still, almost invisible, her presence blending into the background like she had mastered the art of being overlooked, which in truth she had. To most in that room, she was just another administrative assistant, someone who handled paperwork, organized schedules, and quietly slipped in to audit lectures during her break. Someone who, by all visible standards, did not belong in a room reserved for graduate-level minds tackling advanced theoretical mathematics. A few students exchanged glances when they noticed her, subtle smirks forming, whispers barely contained behind half-covered mouths. Because in places like this, appearances often spoke louder than truth, and Emily's appearance told a story that everyone thought they already understood. Professor Harrington set his leather briefcase on the desk with a soft but deliberate thud, turning slowly toward the class as he began outlining a complex mathematical framework on the board. His chalk moving swiftly, confidently, as symbols and equations stretched across the surface like a language only a chosen few could truly comprehend, and as he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who expected to be right. Always. Midway through his explanation, a subtle pause crept into his rhythm, his hand stopping just long enough to suggest something had caught his attention, and then, without warning, he turned back toward the room, his eyes landing directly on Emily again, this time with intention. The shift was almost imperceptible, but the room felt it, a ripple of anticipation moving through the students as they sensed something unfolding, something uncomfortable, something that had the potential to turn into a spectacle. Harrington tilted his head slightly, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of his lips, the kind that wasn't born from kindness but from calculation. And in that moment, the air grew heavier, quieter, as if everyone instinctively understood that someone was about to be placed under a spotlight they hadn't asked for. Emily felt it too, that subtle tightening in her chest, the way silence can press against you before words even arrive. But she didn't look away, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, because she had felt this before, that quiet undercurrent of judgment, the assumption that she was out of place, that she didn't belong. And yet, there was something else beneath her calm exterior, something that hadn't surfaced in a very long time. Harrington's voice broke the silence, smooth but edged with a hint of challenge, as he addressed the room, though his focus never left her, and in that moment, the stage was set, the roles already assigned in the minds of everyone watching, the powerful professor, the simple woman, and the unspoken expectation of what was about to happen next. But what none of them realized, not the students, not the whispers, and certainly not Professor Harrington himself, was that they were about to witness a shift so precise, so undeniable, that it would leave the entire room questioning everything they thought they knew. The lecture hall held its breath, suspended in that fragile space between assumption and truth, and somewhere in that silence, something began to change. Professor Harrington let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the desk as his gaze remained fixed on Emily, and then, with a measured breath, he spoke her into the center of the room without ever raising his voice. "Miss Carter, is it?" he said, as though he had only just noticed her existence, though the precision in his tone suggested otherwise, and a few heads turned immediately, curiosity sparking as students leaned slightly in their seats, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Emily felt every pair of eyes shift toward her, the weight of attention pressing down in a way that was both familiar and unwelcome. Yet she responded with quiet composure, "Yes, Professor," her voice steady but soft, the kind of voice that did not demand attention but carried clarity nonetheless. Harrington nodded slowly, as if confirming a hypothesis only he understood, then gestured toward the chalkboard behind him where a dense network of equations stretched from one side to the other, symbols layered with intention, complexity radiating from every line, and he stepped aside just enough to reveal the full scope of the problem, a problem that most of the graduate students in the room had spent weeks trying to comprehend. "Since you have chosen to join us today," he continued, his tone shifting ever so slightly, "I am sure you would not mind contributing." The words polite on the surface but sharpened underneath, and a ripple of low laughter moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable, as if the outcome had already been decided before the moment had even begun. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around her pen, not from fear, but from the recognition of the pattern unfolding, the familiar sequence of assumption followed by expectation, and she hesitated for only a second before replying. "I am just here to observe, Professor," hoping perhaps to deflect the spotlight, but Harrington's smile deepened, thin and controlled. "Observation is best accompanied by participation," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach every corner of the hall. A student near the front let out a quiet chuckle. Another whispered something to his neighbor, and the atmosphere shifted from academic focus to something more theatrical, something edged with anticipation, because moments like this were not uncommon in Harrington's lectures. He had a reputation for testing boundaries, for exposing weakness, for reminding everyone exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of intellect. He picked up a piece of chalk and underlined a portion of the equation with deliberate emphasis. "This section here has proven particularly challenging, even for those with formal training," he said, glancing briefly at a few of his top students, who suddenly seemed very interested in their notes, unwilling to be drawn into the same spotlight, and then his attention returned to Emily, unwavering. "Perhaps you could walk us through your approach." The room grew quieter, the kind of quiet that hums beneath the surface, charged and expectant. As Emily slowly placed her pen down on the desk, her movements unhurried, almost careful, as though she were stepping into something she had already seen play out before. She rose from her seat, the faint sound of her chair shifting against the polished floor echoing louder than it should have in the stillness, and as she made her way down the aisle, each step seemed to draw more attention, more scrutiny, more silent judgment from those watching, some with amusement, others with curiosity, a few with something closer to discomfort, sensing that the situation was teetering on the edge of something more than a simple academic exercise. Harrington watched her approach with a composed expression, though there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of what was about to happen. And when Emily reached the front of the room, he handed her the chalk with a gesture that felt less like an invitation and more like a challenge. "Take your time," he said, though the cadence of his voice suggested the opposite, and then he stepped back, folding his arms as he positioned himself just off to the side, giving her the full view of the board and the full weight of the audience behind her. Emily stood there for a moment, the chalk resting lightly between her fingers, her gaze moving across the equations, tracing the lines, the variables, the structure, and something subtle shifted in her expression, something almost imperceptible to those watching casually, but unmistakable to anyone who understood what focus truly looked like. The whispers that had lingered in the room faded completely now, replaced by a deeper silence, one that carried tension rather than amusement, and somewhere in the back, a student stopped typing. Another leaned forward, sensing that this moment was no longer unfolding the way they had expected. Harrington tilted his head slightly, studying her with a critical eye, waiting for hesitation, for uncertainty, for the inevitable confirmation of his assumption. But instead, what he saw was stillness, not the kind born from confusion, but the kind that comes just before something precise begins. The chalk lifted slowly toward the board, hovering for a fraction of a second as if aligning with an invisible rhythm, and in that quiet pause, the room seemed to hold its breath again, suspended between doubt and revelation, unaware that the line about to be drawn would not just solve a problem, but would begin to rewrite everything they thought they understood about the woman standing in front of them. The chalk touched the board with a soft, deliberate tap, and for a moment, nothing happened, as if the entire room had leaned into that single point of contact, waiting for hesitation, for uncertainty, for the small signs that would confirm what everyone already believed. But instead, Emily moved with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission, her hand gliding across the surface as she began rewriting a portion of the equation with subtle adjustments, not dramatic enough to draw immediate attention, yet precise enough to shift the structure in a way that only someone deeply familiar with the logic beneath it could understand. A few students exchanged glances, their earlier amusement fading into something more uncertain, because what they expected to be awkward fumbling was unfolding into something measured, intentional, almost effortless, and the faint sound of chalk against the board became the only sound in the room, steady and controlled, like a metronome guiding an unseen rhythm. Harrington's posture remained composed, arms still folded, but there was a slight narrowing of his eyes now, a microscopic shift that betrayed the first flicker of doubt, because Emily was not hesitating. She was not guessing. She was reconstructing, step by step, line by line, her movements reflecting a familiarity that could not be explained by casual observation alone. She paused briefly, stepping back just enough to look at the equation as a whole, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something internal, and then she stepped forward again, adding another line, this time altering a variable transformation that had been sitting unnoticed in the original framework, and a student in the second row leaned forward involuntarily, his brow furrowing as he realized what she had just done, that she was not just following the problem, she was correcting it. A quiet murmur began to ripple through the room, quickly stifled by the tension that had replaced the earlier laughter, because now, no one was certain how to react, and the shift from entertainment to attention was almost palpable. Emily continued her movements, fluid now, the initial weight of scrutiny dissolving as she focused entirely on the board, each line connecting seamlessly to the next, her breathing steady, her posture relaxed, as though she had stepped into a space where none of the surrounding noise existed, and the complexity that had once filled the board with intimidation began to unravel under her hand, not through force, but through clarity. Harrington took a small step forward, almost unconsciously, his eyes scanning what she had written, searching for an error, for a misstep, for anything that would restore the balance he had expected. But the longer he looked, the harder it became to find fault, because her approach was not only valid, it was elegant, reducing layers of unnecessary complication into something cleaner, more direct, more refined. The room had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that does not come from instruction, but from realization, as students who had once smirked now watched with widened eyes, their attention fixed on the board, trying to follow the logic that was unfolding faster than they could process. Emily reached the final step of her solution and stopped, the chalk hovering for a brief second before she placed it gently in the tray, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, and she stepped back, not with pride or expectation, but with a quiet neutrality, as if she had simply completed something that needed to be done. Harrington stood still, his gaze locked on the board, his mind moving rapidly through each line, retracing the steps, checking for inconsistencies, but none appeared, and what unsettled him more was the realization that her solution did not just solve the problem. It exposed a flaw in the way he had originally framed it, a subtle oversight that had gone unnoticed until now. A student in the front row shifted in his seat, glancing at another with a look that silently asked if they were seeing the same thing, and across the room, someone exhaled softly, the sound barely audible but significant in the stillness. Harrington finally looked away from the board and toward Emily, his expression controlled, but the confidence that had once defined. It now carried a fracture, a hesitation that had not been there before, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he did not speak immediately. The authority that had filled the space earlier seemed to waver, just slightly, just enough to be felt, And in that moment, the balance had shifted, not through confrontation, not through defiance, but through something far more undeniable: precision. The room remained suspended in silence, the kind that follows a truth too clear to ignore, and somewhere within that stillness, the roles that had been so confidently assigned at the beginning of the lecture began to dissolve, leaving behind a question no one had expected to ask, not about the problem on the board, but about the woman who had just solved it, as if she had been doing so her entire life. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like a room adjusting to a truth it had not prepared for, and for several long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, as if any sound might disrupt what had just happened. And then, almost imperceptibly, a student near the front cleared his throat. Another leaned back in his chair, and the subtle hum of reality began to return, but it was different now, heavier, charged with something that could not be undone. Professor Harrington finally took a step forward, his polished shoes echoing softly against the wooden floor, his eyes still fixed on the board as if he could will an error into existence simply by looking hard enough. But the equations remained unchanged, precise, undeniable, and the flaw she had corrected stood out now in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He reached for a piece of chalk, his fingers closing around it with a controlled grip, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might challenge her work, might attempt to reclaim the authority that had slipped through his grasp. But instead, he paused, the chalk hovering just short of the board, and in that hesitation, something shifted again, something subtle yet unmistakable, because hesitation was not something anyone had ever seen from him before. Emily remained where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm, not defiant, not proud, simply present, as though the moment did not belong to her but to the truth that had revealed itself through her actions. And she did not rush to explain, did not fill the silence with justification, because she did not need to. Harrington lowered the chalk slowly, turning to face her fully now, and when he spoke, his voice was still steady, but the edge had softened, just enough to be heard by those paying close attention. "That is an interesting approach," he said, choosing his words carefully, though the understatement only emphasized what everyone in the room already understood, that this was far more than interesting. A student in the back shifted forward, unable to contain his curiosity, and another whispered something that was quickly hushed, because no one wanted to be the first to break whatever this moment had become. Harrington stepped closer to the board again, his gaze moving across each line she had written, retracing her logic, and then, almost reluctantly, he nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement that carried more weight than any elaborate praise could have. "You simplified the transformation," he said, more to himself than to the room, "and in doing so, you eliminated the inconsistency in the boundary conditions," his voice trailing slightly at the end, as if the admission itself required adjustment. Emily inclined her head just slightly, not in submission, but in quiet confirmation. "Yes, Professor, the original structure introduced a constraint that was not necessary," her voice even, respectful, yet carrying a clarity that did not diminish itself. The room absorbed her words in silence, the students now listening in a way they had not before, not as observers of a spectacle, but as witnesses to something real, something that challenged their assumptions about who held knowledge and who did not. Harrington exhaled slowly, the sound subtle but noticeable in the stillness, and for a brief moment, the weight of his position seemed to press against him in a way it had not earlier, because this was no longer about a demonstration, it was about recognition, and recognition required something he had not planned to give. He turned slightly toward the class, his posture straightening as he addressed them, though his tone had shifted from authority to something more measured. "What you have just seen," he said, "is an example of alternative reasoning," his words carefully constructed, though the attempt to generalize the moment could not fully contain it, because the truth of it lingered in the air, unspoken but understood. Emily took a small step back, as if to return the space to its original state, but the space itself had changed, and as she turned to walk back toward her seat, the students parted their attention in a way that followed her movement, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but curious, thoughtful, some even unsettled by the realization of how quickly their assumptions had been overturned. She sat down quietly, her notebook still open where she had left it, her pen resting exactly where it had been, as though she had simply stepped away for a moment and returned, but nothing about the room felt the same. Harrington remained at the front, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second longer in her direction before he turned back to the board, and though he resumed speaking, continuing the lecture as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. There was a subtle shift in his cadence, a slight pause between sentences, a recalibration that no one could quite define but everyone could feel. The equations on the board had not changed, but the way the room saw them had, and more importantly, the way the room saw her had transformed completely, not through declaration, not through confrontation, but through a single moment of undeniable clarity. And in that quiet aftermath, something far more powerful than humiliation had taken place, something that did not need to be announced to be understood. The room was no longer the same, and neither was the man who had once believed he controlled it. The lecture continued, but the rhythm had changed in a way no one could fully articulate, as if every word spoken now carried the weight of what had just happened. And even though Professor Harrington resumed explaining advanced concepts, writing new lines across the board with the same practiced precision, there was a subtle hesitation woven into his movements, a faint recalibration that only became visible to those who were paying close attention. The students, once relaxed in their assumptions, now followed each step more carefully, their eyes shifting not only between the board and their notes, but occasionally, almost instinctively, toward Emily, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman they had overlooked with the clarity they had just witnessed. She sat exactly as she had before, her posture composed, her attention focused on her notebook, writing with steady, deliberate strokes, not seeking acknowledgement, not reacting to the glances that occasionally lingered a moment too long, because for her, this moment was not new, it was simply revealed. A student near the aisle leaned slightly toward his classmate, whispering under his breath, "Did you see that transformation?" And the other nodded slowly, his expression still processing, while a third student further back flipped through his notes, trying to match her approach to what he had been taught, only to realize that her solution had bypassed entire layers of complexity he had assumed were necessary. At the front of the room, Harrington paused again, mid-sentence this time, his chalk hovering just above the board, and for a brief second, the silence returned, thinner now but still present, and he cleared his throat lightly before continuing, though the authority in his voice had softened into something more measured, more aware. He glanced over his shoulder at the previous solution still faintly visible beneath the new equations, and though he did not reference it directly, the presence of it lingered like an unspoken correction, one that could not be erased simply by writing over it. Emily closed her notebook gently, the soft sound barely noticeable, and as she lifted her gaze toward the board, there was no trace of tension in her expression, only a quiet attentiveness, as if she were simply following along like any other student. And yet, the room no longer saw her that way. The shift in perception had taken hold, subtle but undeniable, and it manifested in small ways, the way a student hesitated before speaking, the way another reconsidered a question before raising his hand, the way even the air seemed to carry a different kind of awareness. Harrington finished outlining the final segment of the lecture and stepped back, placing the chalk down with more care than usual, his eyes moving across the room as if reassessing the space he had once navigated with absolute certainty, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. Understanding a problem, he said slowly, is not always about complexity. Sometimes it requires clarity, the words simple, almost understated, but the room recognized them for what they were, an acknowledgement, indirect yet unmistakable. A student in the front row shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at Emily before looking back at the professor, as if confirming what everyone was beginning to understand, that the lesson had extended beyond the equations on the board. The class period neared its end, and the usual sounds of closing notebooks and packing bags began to fill the room. But even these familiar movements felt different, quieter, more thoughtful, as if no one wanted to disrupt the lingering presence of what had just unfolded. Emily gathered her things with the same calm efficiency she always had, sliding her notebook into her bag, adjusting the strap over her shoulder, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the attention that now followed her, because for her, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Harrington remained at the front, watching the students as they began to leave, his expression composed but reflective, and when Emily stood to walk toward the aisle, his gaze met hers for a brief moment, not with the challenge that had defined it earlier, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition. He did not speak, and neither did she, but the silence between them carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that neither could deny. As Emily walked toward the exit, the room seemed to part around her, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, a respect that had not been granted before, and as the door closed softly behind her, the lecture hall remained still for just a moment longer, as if holding on to the echo of what had taken place. And in that lingering quiet, one thing had become undeniably clear, that intelligence does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and when it does, it leaves no room for doubt. The hallway outside the lecture hall carried a different kind of energy as students filtered out in clusters. Their voices lower than usual, conversations circling around the same unspoken topic, each of them trying to process what they had just witnessed. And as Emily stepped into that space, the shift followed her. Subtle but unmistakable, as glances lingered longer, and the quiet woman who once passed unnoticed now carried a presence that could not be ignored. A pair of graduate students stood near the lockers, one flipping through his notes with furrowed concentration while the other shook his head slowly, saying under his breath, "That was not just solving the problem, that was rewriting it," and the first nodded, still staring at the page as if expecting the answer to rearrange itself into the form she had shown them. Emily walked past them without pause, her step steady, her expression unchanged, her mind already moving beyond the moment as if it had been just another equation. Another pattern recognized and resolved, because for her, this clarity was not new. It had always been there, waiting quietly beneath the surface of a life that had taught her to remain unseen. Back inside the lecture hall, Professor Harrington remained alone for a moment after the last student had left, the door closing with a soft echo that seemed louder in the emptiness, and he stood there looking at the board, the faint traces of Emily's work still visible beneath the layers he had written over, like a truth that refused to be erased. He reached for the chalk again, hesitating before making a small correction to one of his earlier lines, a movement so slight that no one else would have noticed, but for him it marked something significant, an acknowledgement not spoken aloud, but accepted nonetheless. His reflection caught briefly in the darkened glass of the window, and, for the first time in a long while, there was a question in his eyes not about the mathematics, but about the assumptions that had guided him for years, assumptions that had just been dismantled in a matter of minutes by someone he had almost dismissed entirely. Emily continued down the corridor, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights in long, clean lines, and as she approached the exit doors, she slowed just slightly, her hand brushing against the strap of her bag, her thoughts drifting, not to the reactions or the silence she had left behind, but to something further back, something quieter, the night spent studying under dim kitchen lights, the pages filled with equations no one else had seen, the years of choosing a simpler path, not because she lacked ability, but because she valued something different, something that did not require recognition to exist. Outside, the late afternoon air carried a soft breeze, the campus stretching out in familiar patterns of brick pathways and green lawns, students crossing in every direction, unaware that something inside one of those buildings had just shifted in a way that would ripple far beyond a single lecture. Behind her, the heavy doors opened again, and a voice called out, "Miss Carter," the words measured, controlled, yet carrying an urgency that had not been there before, and Emily turned slowly to see Professor Harrington standing just inside the doorway, his posture straight, but his expression no longer guarded by the same rigid certainty. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had already been said without words, and then he stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet. His voice quieter now, more deliberate. "That method you used," he began, pausing as if selecting each word carefully. "Where did you learn it?" The question simple, but the tone behind it carried something deeper, something closer to respect than interrogation. Emily met his gaze steadily, her answer coming without hesitation. "I did not learn it in the usual way," she said, her voice calm, not defensive, not evasive, simply honest, and the wind moved lightly through the trees. Around them, carrying the faint rustle of leaves that seemed to underline the stillness of the moment. Harrington nodded once, slowly, as if that answer, though incomplete, was enough, and for the first time, he did not attempt to fill the silence that followed, because some things did not need to be explained, they only needed to be recognized. The distance between them remained, not as a barrier, but as a space that had been redefined, no longer divided by assumption, but shaped by understanding, and as Emily turned to continue on her way, there was no need for anything further, no apology, no declaration, because what had changed did not require words to confirm it. The campus moved on around them, students passing by, conversations resuming, the ordinary rhythm of the day continuing as if nothing had happened, and yet, within that ordinary flow, something had been altered, quietly, permanently, in a way that would not be forgotten by those who had witnessed it. And somewhere behind those lecture hall walls, the echo of that moment remained, a silent reminder that true brilliance does not demand attention. It simply waits for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. The late afternoon sun stretched longer shadows across the campus pathways as Emily continued walking, her pace unhurried, her mind already settling back into its usual quiet rhythm. But behind her, something had been set in motion that would not remain contained within a single lecture hall, because moments like that had a way of traveling, carried not by announcements, but by conversations, by disbelief, by the simple human need to retell what felt impossible. Inside a nearby study lounge, a group of students gathered around a table, their laptops open but forgotten, as one of them replayed the sequence on his tablet. A short clip recorded discreetly during the lecture. The image slightly shaky but clear enough to capture the moment Emily's chalk first touched the board. And as the video played, the room leaned in, the earlier skepticism replaced by a focused silence that mirrored what had happened hours before. "That is her, right?" one student asked, pointing at the screen. "The same woman who organizes the faculty schedules," and another nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving the video, saying, "She corrected his model, not just solved it, she corrected it," and the distinction hung in the air, heavy with implication. Back in his office, Professor Harrington stood by the window overlooking the quad, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his desk, his reflection faintly visible in the glass as he replayed the sequence in his mind. Not the public moment, not the reaction of the students, but the precision of her reasoning, the elegance of her approach, the quiet confidence that had not demanded recognition yet commanded it completely. He turned away from the window and moved toward his bookshelf, pulling down a worn volume filled with advanced theoretical frameworks, flipping through pages marked with years of notes, annotations layered over time, and as he compared them mentally to what he had seen, a realization settled deeper, not sudden, but steady, that what Emily had done was not accidental, not instinct alone. It was the result of something refined, something practiced, something earned. Across campus, Emily reached a small office tucked behind the administrative wing, a space modest in size with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a narrow window that let in just enough light to soften the room, and she set her bag down quietly, pulling out her notebook as she sat, opening it to a page filled with equations that stretched far beyond the lecture she had just attended, her handwriting neat, deliberate, covering concepts that most in the university would never expect to find in a place like this. She picked up her pen and continued where she had left off, her focus immediate, uninterrupted, as if the events of the afternoon had been nothing more than a brief pause in a much longer, much deeper process. The phone on her desk rang softly, breaking the stillness, and she answered with the same calm tone she always used. "Administrative office. This is Emily. How may I help you?" Her voice returning seamlessly to the role everyone recognized, the role that had allowed her to exist unnoticed for so long. Meanwhile, in the mathematics department, the conversation had already begun to spread beyond the students, reaching faculty members who spoke in quieter tones, their curiosity piqued not by gossip, but by the implications of what they were hearing, because a correction at that level, delivered with that kind of precision, was not something that could be easily dismissed. Harrington stepped out of his office, his steps measured but purposeful, as he made his way down the corridor, passing colleagues who greeted him as usual, though some held their gaze a fraction longer, sensing that something had shifted, even if they did not yet understand what. He paused briefly outside the administrative wing, his hand hovering near the door as if weighing a decision, and then he pushed it open, stepping into a quieter space where the pace of the university slowed, where the hum of academic debate gave way to the steady rhythm of organization and routine. Inside, Emily sat at her desk, her attention focused on the page in front of her, unaware of his presence for just a moment longer. And in that moment, the contrast was undeniable, the world of prestige and recognition standing just a few feet away from the quiet space where her work continued without audience, without acknowledgement. Harrington observed her for a second, not as a professor evaluating a student, but as someone encountering a question he had not yet learned how to ask. And when she finally looked up, meeting his gaze with the same steady calm, the silence that followed carried a different weight than before, no longer defined by challenge, but by something deeper, something that was still unfolding. The distance between who she appeared to be and what she had revealed had not closed. It had expanded, stretching beyond easy explanation. And in that space, something new began to take shape, not yet fully formed, but undeniable in its presence, like the beginning of a realization that could not be ignored once it had started. Harrington stepped fully into the administrative office, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights replacing the distant echoes of lecture halls and academic debate. And for a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the contrast. The modest desk, the neatly organized files, the absence of anything that would suggest the kind of intellectual depth he had just witnessed. And yet, the evidence was sitting right in front of him, not displayed, not announced, but undeniably present. Emily closed her notebook gently as she met his gaze, her expression calm, neither surprised nor unsettled by his presence, as if she had anticipated that this moment might come, though she did not rush to fill the silence that stretched between them. Harrington cleared his throat softly, a subtle gesture that felt unfamiliar even to him, as though the words he was about to speak required a different kind of precision than any equation he had ever written. "I reviewed what you did in class," he began, his voice measured, careful, not carrying the authority it once did, but something quieter, more deliberate, and Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her attention fully present. "You did not just solve the problem," Harrington continued, stepping a little closer, his eyes searching hers not for answers, but for understanding. "You restructured it in a way that suggests a deeper familiarity with the theory than most of my graduate students possess, and the admission, though controlled, carried a weight that could not be disguised." Emily held his gaze steadily, her response coming after a brief pause, not out of hesitation, but out of thoughtfulness. "I have spent a long time studying it," she said simply, her tone even, not seeking validation, not offering explanation beyond what was necessary, and the simplicity of her answer only deepened the question behind it. Harrington exhaled slowly, his mind moving through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last, because nothing about her position, her role, or her presence in that lecture hall aligned with the level of understanding she had demonstrated. And yet, the evidence was irrefutable. "Where?" he asked quietly, the single word carrying more weight than a longer question ever could, and Emily's eyes shifted briefly toward the notebook she had just closed, then back to him, not avoiding, but choosing carefully how much to reveal. "Not here," she replied, her voice soft but clear, and the answer, though brief, carried an entire history within it, one that did not need to be explained to be understood. Harrington nodded once, slowly, absorbing that response, recognizing that whatever path had brought her to this point was not one defined by traditional markers, not by degrees displayed on walls or titles printed on office doors, but by something far more personal, far more deliberate. He glanced around the small office again, the simplicity of it now carrying a different meaning, no longer a sign of limitation but of choice, and when he looked back at her, the shift in his perspective was complete, no longer searching for flaws, no longer questioning her place, but acknowledging that his understanding of that place had been incomplete. "There is a symposium next month," he said after a moment, his voice steadier now, though still measured. "We will be presenting new approaches to this exact framework." And the words hung in the air, not as a command, not even as an expectation, but as an opening, something he would not have considered offering just hours earlier. Emily listened without reacting immediately, her gaze thoughtful, as if weighing not the opportunity itself, but what it represented, and the room seemed to hold that decision in silence, the same kind of silence that had filled the lecture hall, but this time, it carried something different, not tension but possibility. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her voice calm, respectful, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it, something that suggested she was not defined by invitations or recognition, that her work existed regardless of whether it was seen, and Harrington recognized that too, the difference between someone seeking validation and someone who no longer needed it. He nodded again, more definitively this time, as if acknowledging not just her response, but the understanding behind it, and for a brief moment, the roles that had once defined their interaction disappeared entirely, leaving only two individuals standing in a shared space of respect. Outside the office, footsteps passed by, conversations continued, the normal rhythm of the university carrying on without pause, unaware that within that small room, something far more significant had taken place than any scheduled lecture or formal presentation. Harrington stepped back slightly, the distance between them no longer representing hierarchy, but balance, and as he turned toward the door, He paused just long enough to glance back at her, his expression composed, but with a clarity that had not been there before. "What you did today," he said quietly, "was exceptional, and the word, simple as it was, carried no condescension, no reservation, only truth," and Emily inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not absorbing the praise, but accepting the recognition without resistance. As he left the office, the door closing softly behind him, the space returned to its quiet state, but it no longer felt the same, because something had shifted beyond visibility, something that did not need to be spoken to exist. Emily reopened her notebook, her pen returning to the page with the same steady motion as before, and as she continued her work, the world outside moved on, unaware that within that quiet persistence lay a brilliance that did not seek the spotlight, but could not be hidden from it forever. In the days that followed, the moment inside that lecture hall did not fade as quickly as most expected. It lingered, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet conversations, in reconsidered assumptions, in the subtle way students now approached their work with a different kind of awareness, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. Emily continued her routine as she always had, arriving early, organizing schedules, answering calls with the same calm efficiency, her presence once again blending into the background of the administrative office. Yet the difference now was not in her behavior, but in the way others perceived her, because once a truth has been revealed, it cannot be unseen. A few students began stopping by the office under the pretense of simple questions, lingering just a moment longer than necessary, their curiosity barely concealed, and Emily responded to. Each of them with the same quiet patience, offering guidance when appropriate, never overstepping, never drawing attention to herself, as if she understood that recognition, once forced, loses its meaning. Professor Harrington, on the other hand, found himself approaching his lectures differently, not in content, but in tone, his words carrying a measured clarity that reflected a deeper awareness. And though he remained respected, even admired, there was a noticeable shift in the way he engaged, less inclined to challenge for the sake of dominance, more inclined to listen for the possibility of insight, no matter its source. The symposium he had mentioned approached steadily, and with it came the usual preparation, faculty meetings, revisions, debates over methodology, but woven into those discussions was an unspoken acknowledgement of the gap that had been exposed, the understanding that brilliance does not always announce itself in expected forms. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the windows of the administrative office, Harrington returned, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet intention, and when Emily looked up from her work, the familiarity of the moment was replaced by something steadier, something that no longer required explanation. He placed a small folder on her desk, its contents neatly arranged, and for a moment, he did not speak, allowing the gesture itself to carry meaning. And when he finally did, his voice was calm, direct. "There is a section of the symposium that remains unresolved," he said, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, and Emily glanced at the folder, her eyes scanning its contents briefly, recognizing the framework, the structure, the same complexity that had once filled the board in that lecture hall. She closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on its cover for a moment, and then she looked back at him, her expression thoughtful, not dismissive, not eager, simply grounded in her own understanding of what mattered. "I will take a look," she said, her tone even, and the simplicity of her response carried more weight than any elaborate acceptance could have, because it was not driven by ambition but by purpose. Harrington nodded, a small acknowledgement that spoke of trust rather than authority, and as he turned to leave, there was no need for further words, no need to define roles or expectations, because those had already been reshaped in ways that neither of them could ignore. The campus continued its rhythm, students moving between classes, faculty engaging in their routines, the world outside unchanged in its appearance. Yet beneath that surface, something quieter had taken root, a shift in perception, a reminder that intelligence is not bound by titles, nor confined to places where it is expected to appear. Emily reopened the folder later that evening, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the pages as she studied them with the same focus she had always carried, her pen moving steadily, refining, adjusting, revealing patterns that others had overlooked, not for recognition, not for validation, but because it was simply what she did. And somewhere across campus, Professor Harrington sat in his office, reviewing his own work with a different lens, one shaped not by certainty, but by humility, understanding now that knowledge is not diminished by being challenged, but strengthened by it. The distance between them no longer defined by status or assumption, but by a shared respect for something greater than